The back of a stranger's hand cracked across Evelyn Carter's cheek before she even set down the whiskey bottle. She staggered against the bar, tasting blood, and the tavern erupted in laughter until a chair scraped back like thunder. Nathaniel Whitaker, the richest and coldest man on the northern ridge, rose to his full height, crossed the room in 4 strides, and seized the drunk by his collar. "Touch her again," he said, voice flat as a gravestone, "and I'll bury you myself." Then he turned to Evelyn and said words that would change her life forever. "Marry me." Before we go any further, if you're watching this from a city or town somewhere out there, drop it in the comments below. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe, stay with me until the very end, and let's find out together where this journey takes them. The drunk's collar was still bunched in Nate's fist when the words left his mouth, and for a moment, nobody in the tavern breathed. Evelyn wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her wrist and stared at him like he'd lost his senses. "What did you say? You heard me?" Nate shoved the drunk backward into a table of empty bottles and didn't so much as glance at the mess he made. "Marry me." "Mister, I don't know you." "Nobody does." He said it plain like a fact about the weather. "Doesn't matter. I need a wife. You need money. Seems to me we can solve 2 problems at the same table." Mort Higgins, the tavern keeper, came around the bar with his apron still tied and his face gone the color of ash. "Now hold on, Whitaker. That girl works for me. She's got debts to settle before she goes running off with, how much?" Nate didn't look at him. "Beg your pardon?" "Her debts. How much does she owe you?" Mort's mouth opened and closed. Evelyn watched him do the arithmetic in his head, watched him decide how much a man like Nathaniel Whitaker could be squeezed for. $40, Mort said, though everyone in the room knew it wasn't true. 20, Evelyn said before Nate could answer. "I've kept the books myself since my husband passed Mr. Higgins, and you know it's 20, not 40. Don't try that with me." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Mort's face went red. Nate's eyes shifted to her for the first time since he'd grabbed the drunk, and something in them sharpened, not anger. Interest. 20 then, Nate said, and he set the coins on the bar without counting them twice, without hesitating, like the number had never mattered to him at all. "That settles what she owes you. She doesn't work here anymore. Now you can't just—" "I just did." Mort looked between the 2 of them, weighing whether it was worth the fight, and decided it wasn't. He scooped the coins off the bar and disappeared into the back room, muttering. Evelyn stood there with her apron still on, blood drying at the corner of her mouth, staring at a man she'd never spoken 2 words to in her life. "You can't just buy a person, Mr. Whitaker. I'm not buying you." He said it steady, without softness, without apology. "I'm offering you a job. 6 months. My wife in name only. You'll have a roof, food, and $200 when it's done. Enough to leave this town and never look back. And if I say no, then I ride out of here alone, same as I rode in." He picked his hat up off the table where he'd thrown it and turned it once in his hands. "But you'll still owe Higgins his $40 he's fixing to invent by morning, and you'll still be sleeping on that cot in the back with a lock that doesn't work. I've heard about that lock, Miss Carter. Everybody in this town has." Her jaw tightened. He knew her name. That unsettled her more than the proposal did. "There's a condition," he added. "There's always a condition with men like you." "No feelings." His voice didn't waver. "No touching. No pretending even to yourself that this is real. You do the job. I pay you. In 6 months we part ways, and neither one of us owes the other a single thing more." Evelyn studied his face, the hard line of his jaw, the eyes that gave nothing away, the way he stood like a man who'd built walls so high around himself he'd forgotten what was on the other side. She'd seen desperate men before. She'd seen cruel men, greedy men, men who smiled while they lied. She knew what that looked like. This wasn't that. This was loneliness wearing a rich man's coat. "Give me until morning," she said. "You have until sunup. I'm not a patient man." She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her cot with the lock that didn't work, staring at the ledger she'd kept hidden beneath the floorboard since Thomas died. The one with the numbers that told the truth nobody in this town wanted to hear. Debts. His debts mostly run up before the fever took him. Debts a moneylender named Grady had been circling like a vulture for 8 months, waiting for the day she couldn't pay. That day was coming faster than she'd hoped. A knock came at her door near midnight, soft enough that she almost mistook it for wind. She opened it a crack and found Grady himself standing in the cold, with his ledger tucked under one arm and a smile that never once touched his eyes. "Evening, Mrs. Carter. Word travels fast in a town this small. Heard you had yourself an offer today." "It's none of your business, Mr. Grady. Everything about your husband's debt is my business, ma'am, seeing as you're the one carrying it now." He leaned against her doorframe like he owned it. $60 by the end of the month, or I take it out of your hide one way or another. You understand me?" She did. She understood him perfectly. She'd understood men like him since she was old enough to understand anything. "I'll have your money," she said, and shut the door before he could answer. She sat back down on the cot and pressed her palm flat against the ledger, against the only proof that her husband hadn't lied to her about everything, that some part of what they'd built together had been real. $200 was more than she'd see in 3 years, scrubbing floors at Higgins's tavern. $200 was Grady's threat turned to dust. $200 was a train ticket somewhere nobody knew her name, and nobody could slap her for spilling whiskey on a man's boots. 6 months. No feelings. No touching. She could do 6 months of nothing. She'd done worse for less. At sunup, she was standing outside the livery with a single carpet bag holding everything she owned in the world, waiting before Nate Whitaker had even climbed down from his horse. He looked at the bag, looked at her, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face and vanished just as fast. "You're punctual." "I don't like being made to wait on other people's decisions." "Neither do I." He held out a folded paper. "Contract's here. Read it before you sign it." She blinked. Most men, she'd learned, expected a woman to take their word for things to sign wherever a finger pointed and trust that the ink meant what she'd been told it meant. Her own husband hadn't. But Nate simply stood there and waited, like reading it was the only sensible thing to do. She unfolded the paper and read every line twice. 6 months. $200 upon completion, $50 in advance. Room board and the express understanding that the marriage existed on paper, only dissolvable by either party without penalty at the end of the term. "There's no clause here about what happens if I get hurt," she said. "Working your land, your household. What happens if something befalls me under your roof?" Nate's eyebrows lifted slightly. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to surprise on his face. "You want that written in?" "I want everything I'm agreeing to written in, Mr. Whitaker. I learned the hard way that a man's promise and a man's contract don't always say the same thing." He took the paper back, pulled a stub of pencil from his coat, and added 3 lines in a hand cramped and careful. He handed it back to her. She read it again. Medical care, his expense no exceptions. Satisfied, for now. He almost smiled. Almost. Back. The ride to his mountain took 2 days through country that grew colder and stranger, with every mile switchback trails cut into rock wind that came down off the peaks like something with teeth. Nate rode ahead with his foreman, a weathered man named Silas Boone, who eyed Evelyn like she was a problem he hadn't been consulted on. She rode behind them cold to the bone, gripping the reins with hands that had gone numb an hour past. On the second afternoon, crossing a narrow shelf of trail with a drop on one side that made her stomach turn just to look at her horse's hoof, caught a slick patch of black ice hidden under a dusting of snow. The animal screamed and reared front legs, pawing air, and for one endless second, Evelyn felt the whole world tilt sideways toward the edge. She didn't scream. She'd learned long ago that screaming never helped. She threw her weight forward low over the horse's neck and spoke to it in a voice pitched calm and steady, even as her own heart hammered fit to break her ribs. "Easy. Easy now. I've got you." Her hands found the reins loose instead of yanking them tight the way her father had taught her, Decades before he died, the way every panicked rider got wrong. The horse's front hooves came down. It danced sideways snorting, but it came down on solid rock instead of empty air. Silas had already wheeled his horse around face white, reaching for his rifle like he meant to shoot the animal out from under her. Nate was faster. He was off his horse and at her side before she'd even caught her breath, one hand on her horse's bridle, the other reaching up toward her, like he meant to pull her down bodily. "I'm fine," she said before he could touch her. "I'm fine, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at her for a long moment at the color drained from her face, the white-knuckled grip she still had on the reins, the way she hadn't screamed even once. Most folks would have come off that horse. Most folks weren't raised on a Missouri farm with a father who broke horses for a living. Her voice shook only slightly. "I know how to sit a spooked animal, Mr. Whitaker. I don't know how to sit still while people talk about me like I'm not standing right here." Silas cleared his throat and looked away. Nate's jaw worked like he was chewing on something he wasn't used to swallowing. Respect maybe for a woman he'd expected to be nothing more than a signature on a piece of paper. "Noted," he said, and swung back up onto his horse without another word. But she saw the way he watched her for the rest of the ride. Different now, like he was recalculating something. The lodge came into view at dusk, a great dark shape of timber and stone, crouched against the mountainside smoke, curling from a single chimney into a sky gone the color of a bruise. It was bigger than any house Evelyn had ever set foot in, bigger than the church back home, and it looked more than anything like something built to keep people out rather than to welcome anyone in. Inside it was worse. Beautiful furniture sat under sheets of dust. A grand hearth held nothing but cold ash. The kitchen shelves were stocked with tins and sacks that had clearly gone untouched for weeks. It was a house with money poured into every corner and love poured into none of them. "There's a room for you upstairs, second door on the left," Nate said, already shrugging out of his coat, already moving toward the stairs like the conversation was finished. "Silas will see to your bag. Mr. Whitaker." He stopped one boot on the first step. "This house is freezing, and half your stores have gone to mold sitting in damp tins. If I'm to live here, even for 6 months, I won't do it shivering and eating spoiled beans. It's a house, Miss Carter. It keeps the weather off. That's all I've ever asked of it." "Well, I intend to ask more of it than that." She set her bag down herself, refusing to wait on Silas, and pulled her sleeves up past her wrists. "Where do you keep the wood?" Something crossed his face, then not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow. "Out back. Mind the axe, it's dull." "Then I'll sharpen it." He watched her walk toward the door like a man watching weather change directions he hadn't predicted, and said nothing at all. By the third night, the house had begun in small and stubborn ways to stop feeling like a tomb. There was a fire built properly in the hearth. There was bread rising under a cloth on the table, the smell of it filling rooms that hadn't held the scent of anything but dust in longer than Nate cared to remember. He came in from the mine each evening, bone-tired, and found the lamps lit before full dark, found a plate set at the table without being asked, found himself, more than once, forgetting the rule he'd made about no feelings. It was on the fourth night that she found the shawl. She'd been sorting through a chest in the hallway looking for extra blankets, and beneath a stack of old quilts, her fingers found something soft and delicate. A woman's shawl, pale blue, moth-eaten at the edges, folded with a care that told her it hadn't been packed away carelessly. It had been packed away like something precious. Like a wound somebody kept bandaged so they wouldn't have to look at it. She was still holding it when Nate came around the corner and saw her. His face changed so fast it frightened her. All the small ease that had crept into his shoulders these past few days vanished in an instant, replaced by something cold and closed and furious. "Put that back." "I didn't mean to. I said put it back." His voice cracked like a whip and she flinched, despite herself, despite 3 years of learning not to flinch at raised voices. He saw her flinch, and something in his own eyes flickered with regret, quickly buried. "That's not yours to go through." "I was looking for blankets." "Then look somewhere else." He crossed the hall and took the shawl from her hands gently. She noted far more gently than his voice had been, and folded it back into the chest like he was tucking a child into bed. "This house has rooms you don't need to be in, Miss Carter. Remember that." He walked away before she could say anything else, and she stood alone in the hallway, with her heart pounding, understanding for the first time just how deep the wound in this man ran and how little he intended to let her near it. Tuh. The knock at the door came 2 mornings later, hard and impatient, the kind of knock that expected to be answered immediately. Evelyn opened it to find a man in a fine gray coat standing on the porch, a leather satchel under one arm, and a smile stretched thin across a face that reminded her instantly and unpleasantly of Grady back in town. Money dressed up as manners. Cruelty wearing good boots. "You must be the new Mrs. Whitaker." He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past her into the front room, like he'd walked through that door 100 times before. "Charles Beaumont. I don't believe Nate's mentioned me." "He hasn't. He wouldn't." Beaumont set his satchel on the table and began pulling papers from it without so much as removing his hat. "I own the Ridge property adjoining this one, Mrs. Whitaker, and I've got a great deal of interest in whether this marriage of yours is what it claims to be." Nate came in from the yard at that moment, and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees just from the look on his face. "Beaumont. Nathaniel." Beaumont didn't turn around. "Just explaining to your wife here that the Territorial Land Office takes a dim view of claims filed under false household status. Fraud, they call it. Prison some cases. Get out of my house. Not until I've seen the marriage license." Beaumont finally turned, and his eyes moved over Evelyn slow, and assessing the way a man might look over a horse he suspected was lame. "Won't take but a moment if everything's as legitimate as you claim." Evelyn felt her pulse jump, but she kept her face still the way she'd trained herself to during 3 years of Grady's visits, and worse men than him. Her eyes fell to the papers Beaumont had spread across the table, and something in the columns of figures caught snagged, refused to let go of her attention. The land survey dates didn't match the filing dates. Anyone glancing at it would miss it. But she'd spent 4 years keeping her husband's freight ledgers, 4 years learning to spot the difference between a number that was true and a number that had been altered to look true, and this had been altered. "Mr. Beaumont," she said before Nate could throw him bodily out the door, which looked to be seconds away from happening. "This survey you're waving around, it's dated March the 14th. But this filing beneath it references a boundary marker that, according to territorial records, wasn't placed until April." She looked up at him, calm as still water. "Seems to me somebody's paperwork doesn't agree with itself, Mr. Beaumont. I wonder whose." The color drained out of Beaumont's face so fast it might have been comical under different circumstances. He snatched the papers back off the table like they'd burned him. That's a clerical matter, nothing more." "Of course it is." Evelyn folded her hands in front of her apron, sweet as Sunday, sharp as a blade beneath it. "I'm sure the land office will see it the same way should anyone think to ask them." Beaumont's jaw worked. He looked at Nate, who was watching Evelyn now with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between astonishment and the first real warmth she'd seen cross his face since she'd arrived. "This isn't finished," Beaumont said, stuffing his papers back into his satchel with hands that weren't quite steady. "Not by a long mile." "Doors behind you," Nate said. Beaumont left without another word, his boots hammering hard against the porch boards, his horse tearing off down the mountain trail like the devil himself was chasing him. The house went quiet. Evelyn realized her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed the way they always did, after the way they'd shaken after every hard moment in her life, once it was safely behind her, instead of in front. Nate crossed the room slowly, like he was approaching something he didn't want to spook. "How'd you catch that I've looked at that man's paperwork a dozen times and never seen it? I kept my husband's books for 4 years, Mr. Whitaker. I know what a lie looks like when somebody's tried to dress it up as a number." She met his eyes steady, despite the tremor still working through her hands. "You didn't marry a helpless woman off a tavern floor. I'd be obliged if you'd stop looking at me like you did." Something shifted in his face, then some wall coming down half an inch no more. Noted, he said again, softer this time than he'd said it on the mountain trail. But his eyes stayed on her a long moment after, like a man looking at something he was only just beginning to understand he could not afford to lose. The days settled into a rhythm neither one of them spoke of out loud, the way two people learn a dance without ever agreeing to dance it. Evelyn rose before the sun to build the fire. Nate left before full light to walk the ridge with Silas, checking the mine timbers, checking the weather, checking everything a man checks when he's spent years believing disaster comes for those who stop watching for it. By the time he came back for the midday meal, there was always something warm on the table, and he always ate like a man surprised every single day that the food was there at all. "You don't have to cook for me at noon," he said one morning, standing in the doorway with snow still melting off his shoulders. "I can eat cold biscuits same as any man." "I know you can." Evelyn didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "I'm not doing it because you need it, Mr. Whitaker. I'm doing it because I like knowing something in this house is warm." He stood there a moment longer than the sentence called for, like he was turning it over, looking for the catch in it and finding none. "Suit yourself," he said, and hung his coat on the peg by the door, instead of the one nearer the stairs, which put him 3 feet closer to the kitchen table than he'd stood the week before. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. It was small things like that stacking up day after day that had begun to worry her more than Beaumont's papers ever had. Beaumont was a danger she understood. Grady back in town was a danger she'd learned to read like weather. But this quiet creeping ease, this feeling of a fire that was actually warm, and a house that was starting to smell like bread instead of dust. This was the kind of danger that could undo a woman who'd spent 3 years teaching herself not to want anything at all. "Careful," she muttered to herself one evening alone in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing anymore. "Careful, Evelyn. This isn't yours to keep." But her hands kept moving anyway, wiping the counter down twice, straightening the same 3 jars on the same shelf, making a house that belonged to another woman's memory feel, in small, stubborn ways, like it might belong to her too. The trouble started, as trouble in a mountain town always did, with a trip for supplies. Nate hadn't wanted her to go. He'd said as much over breakfast, blunt as a hammer, the way he said most things. "Silas can bring back what we need. No cause for you to ride down there. I need thread needles and a length of good wool if you want that coat of yours patched before it falls apart at the seams," Evelyn said, tying her bonnet strings with hands that didn't so much as pause. "Silas is a fine man, Mr. Whitaker, but I doubt he knows worsted from flannel, and I'm not about to trust my sewing to his eye. Town's not kind to you, you know that." She did know it. She'd known it the moment Mort Higgins's coins hit the bar, the moment word spread through Silver Ridge that the widow from the tavern had ridden off with Nathaniel Whitaker and come back wearing his name. She knew exactly what kind of looks waited for her on that street, and she'd decided somewhere over the last 2 weeks that she wasn't going to let any of them keep her locked up in a mountain lodge like something ashamed of itself. "I've survived worse than unkind looks," she said. "I'll survive this too." Nate's jaw worked. He didn't argue further, but he sent Silas along with her anyway and didn't pretend it was for the sake of carrying packages. Silver Ridge hadn't changed in the 2 weeks she'd been gone, except that now every eye in it seemed to follow her. Women who'd never spoken 2 words to her outside the tavern suddenly had a great deal to whisper about behind gloved hands. A cluster of them stood outside the dry goods store, and Evelyn felt their stares land on her like stones as she climbed down from the wagon. "Well, look who's come down off her mountain," one of them said, not quiet enough to pretend it was private. "Mrs. Whitaker, now is it funny how fast some women climb once they set their minds to it?" Evelyn kept her spine straight and her steps even. "Morning, Mrs. Ashford. I hear it's not a real marriage at all." Mrs. Ashford's smile was sweet as spoiled milk. "I hear it's just paper. Just money changing hands, same as it always did for you, only now it's dressed up nicer." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, right in the soft, unhealed place Evelyn had been carrying since Thomas died, and left her with nothing but debts and a cot with a broken lock. She felt heat rise in her face, felt the old instinct to shrink, to apologize for existing, to make herself small enough that the cruelty would pass over her and land on someone else. She'd spent 3 years learning that instinct. She was done indulging it. "You're welcome to hear whatever you like, Mrs. Ashford," Evelyn said, meeting the woman's eyes without blinking. "I've found people generally hear exactly what makes them feel best about their own lives. But I'll tell you what's true since you seem so interested in my business. I keep an honest house. I've never taken a cent I didn't earn, and I've never once in my life needed to tear another woman down to feel taller. That's more than I can say for some." The color that rose in Mrs. Ashford's cheeks was worth every bit of the walk into town. The other women exchanged glances, and one of them, a younger woman Evelyn didn't recognize, actually pressed her lips together to hide a smile. Silas, standing a few feet off with an armful of feed sacks, made a sound that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough, but the victory was short-lived. Grady was waiting outside the mercantile when she came out with her thread and wool, leaning against the porch post, with his ledger tucked under his arm. Like always, that same thin smile stretched across his face. "Mrs. Whitaker." He said the name like it tasted sour in his mouth. "Congratulations are in order, I suppose." "Mr. Grady, I'll admit I didn't see it coming. Widow Carter married to the richest man on the ridge inside a fortnight." He fell into step beside her as she walked toward the wagon uninvited, the way men like him always were. Makes a fellow wonder what else you've got hidden away that he doesn't know about. Her stomach turned cold, but her face didn't show it. "Is there something you needed, Mr. Grady, or did you simply come to admire the view?" "There's the matter of your late husband's debt, which was paid, in full. You have my receipt." There was a second note. Grady stopped walking and opened his ledger, running one finger down a column of figures that Evelyn had never once seen before in her life. Thomas Carter took a loan against next season's crop the spring before he passed. $30 with interest accrued. Comes to near 50 now. Evelyn's hands went very still on the wagon rail. "That's a lie." "That's my ledger, ma'am." "Then your ledger is wrong, or you've written something into it that was never there to begin with." She kept her voice level, though her pulse was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I kept every one of my husband's accounts myself, Mr. Grady, right up until the day he died, and there was no second note. I'd stake my life on it." "Well?" Grady closed the ledger with a soft, satisfied click. "Seems a shame you'd have to, when your new husband's got money enough to make the whole unpleasant business disappear without either of us needing to raise our voices about it." And there it was. Not a debt at all. A shakedown dressed up in numbers aimed straight at Nate's fortune through the one weak seam Grady thought he'd found in her. Silas had gone very quiet beside her, watching the exchange with the flat, careful stillness of a man deciding whether he needed to intervene. "Mr. Grady," Evelyn said, and something in her voice had changed. Gone sharp. Gone cold. Gone entirely unafraid. "I've spent 4 years reading ledgers for a living, and I promise you I know a fabricated entry when I see one. That ink is fresher than the rest of that page by a matter of weeks, not years. You wrote that note in some time after you heard I'd married money. I'd wager the Territorial Recorder's office would find that mighty interesting should I mention it to them." Grady's smile finally faltered. "You bring that ledger anywhere near my husband," she went on, and the word husband came out of her mouth easier than she expected it to, easier than it had any right to, after 2 weeks of a marriage built on paper alone. "And I will see you charged with fraud so fast you won't have time to burn the evidence. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, Grady just looked at her, reassessing the way Beaumont had reassessed her over his falsified survey, the way every man in this territory seemed to keep having to reassess her once they realized the tavern girl they'd underestimated could read a number better than they could. "You've got teeth now," he said finally. "Didn't used to." "I always had them, Mr. Grady. You just never gave me cause to bite." He left without another word, his boots striking the boardwalk hard and fast, and Evelyn stood there shaking the same way she'd shaken after Beaumont's papers. The tremor arriving late, always late once the danger had already passed, and there was nothing left to do but feel it. Silas cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I ain't ever seen anybody talk to Grady like that and walk away still breathing. I've had practice not being afraid of men who want me to be." He studied her a moment, something shifting behind his weathered face. "Nate's a lucky man," he said quiet, like he hadn't quite meant to say it out loud. "Reckon he don't even know it yet." They rode back up the mountain in silence for the first hour. Evelyn turning Grady's fabricated ledger over and over in her mind, wondering how many more angles men like him and Beaumont would find to come at her from before this was over. It was Silas, unprompted, who finally broke the quiet. "You asked me once why Nate keeps that house shut up the way he does. All them empty rooms." Evelyn's head came around sharp. "I didn't ask you that. You were thinking it loud enough, I heard it anyway." Silas kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his voice gone low and careful, like a man handling something fragile. "Ain't my place to tell his business. But you're living under his roof now, and a person ought to know what kind of ghosts share a house with them." Evelyn said nothing, just waited the way she'd learned to wait when someone was working up the courage to say something that cost them. Nate had a wife once, Margaret. Silas said the name like it still hurt to shape it. "Sweetest woman you ever met. And a little girl, Sarah, couldn't have been more than 4. Fever took through the camp. The winter of '69 tore through half the families on this mountain before it burned itself out. Margaret nursed half the camp before she ever thought to worry on herself. By the time she took sick, it was already too late for her, and it was too late for Sarah not 2 weeks after." The wagon jolted over a rut in the trail, and Evelyn barely noticed her whole body gone still with the weight of what she was hearing. "Nate wasn't even here when it happened," Silas went on. "Down in Denver, settling a mining claim. 3 weeks he was gone, and by the time he got back, there wasn't nothing left to bury but 2 small graves and a house gone silent as a church on a Tuesday. He ain't been the same man since. Shut the whole place up, boarded rooms he couldn't stand to look at, and told anybody who asked that he didn't need nothing from nobody ever again." Evelyn thought of the shawl in the chest, the way Nate's voice had cracked like a whip when he found her holding it, the fury that hadn't really been fury at all, but grief wearing fury's clothes because grief alone was too heavy to carry in front of another living soul. "The shawl," she said quietly. "It was Margaret's." Silas nodded once, grim. "Now you understand why he made you sign a paper full of rules before he'd let you set foot in that house. Man's not trying to keep you out, Mrs. Whitaker. He's trying to keep himself from losing something again. Easier to never let a thing matter than to lose it twice." Evelyn stared at the mountain rising ahead of them, gray and cold and enormous, and understood with a clarity that frightened her exactly what kind of man she'd agreed to spend 6 months pretending to love. Not a cruel man. Not even truly a cold one. A man who'd buried his whole heart alongside his wife and daughter and built a fortune on top of the grave so he'd never have to look at it again. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Don't thank me." Silas flicked the reins, urging the horses faster up the last stretch of trail as the light began to fail. "Just be careful with him, ma'am. He's tougher than granite on the outside. Inside, he's about as fragile as a man can get, and still walk around breathing." Sure. She found him that night at the edge of the tree line behind the lodge, a lantern set on a flat stone. Beside him, standing before 2 small markers she hadn't known were there, because she'd never had cause to walk this far past the house before. She stopped a dozen paces off, not wanting to intrude on something so plainly private, but he must have heard her boots on the frozen ground, because he spoke without turning. "Silas told you?" It wasn't a question. Evelyn came a few steps closer anyway, close enough to see the names carved into the stone in the lantern light. Margaret Ann Whitaker. Sarah Grace. Whitaker, aged 4 years. "He thought I ought to know," she said. "I'm sorry, Nate. I'm sorrier than I know how to say." He was quiet a long moment, his shoulders set in a hard line against the cold. "I wasn't here," he said finally, and his voice had none of its usual iron in it, just a raw, worn-down honesty that hurt to hear. 3 weeks in Denver, over a mining claim that wasn't worth a tenth of what it cost me. By the time I got back..." He stopped, started again. "I keep thinking if I'd been here maybe I'd have caught the fever early." maybe I'd have known what to do. Instead, I was signing papers over a hole in the ground while my whole world went into the dirt without me. That wasn't your fault. Feels like it was. He finally turned to look at her, and in the lantern light, his face was stripped of every wall he usually kept bolted shut. You want to know why I made those rules, Evelyn? No feelings, no touching. It's not because I don't feel things. It's because I remember exactly how much it costs when you do, and I decided a long time back I wasn't paying that price twice. She stood there in the cold with her breath fogging the air between them, and every practical, careful instinct in her told her to say something safe. Something that respected the contract. Something that kept the 6 months exactly as simple as they'd agreed to make it. Instead, she said, "Grief doesn't ask permission before it comes, Nate. And love doesn't either. You can build every wall in the territory, and one day something small is going to walk right through it anyway, same as it always does." Is that a warning? It's a fact. She held his gaze steady, unflinching the same way she'd held Grady's and Beaumont's. Except this time there was nothing cold in it at all. You don't have to let me in. I'm not asking you to. But don't stand out here in the freezing dark and tell me you've got no feelings left, Nathaniel Whitaker, because I've watched you hang your coat 3 feet closer to my kitchen every single day for 2 weeks, and men with no feelings don't do that. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far, said too much, broken some unspoken rule bigger than the paper one sitting folded in a drawer back at the house. Nate's jaw worked, his eyes bright in the lantern light, with something that might have been anger or might have been the exact opposite. "Go on inside," he said finally, quiet, rough. "It's cold." She went, but she looked back once from the porch and saw him still standing there between the 2 small graves, not moving, like a man caught between the life he'd buried and the one standing in his kitchen every evening, whether he asked for it or not. The accident at the mine came 4 days later, and it came fast. The way real disaster always did. No warning, no build. Just one moment, everything was ordinary, and the next moment a man named Jed Coulter was screaming under a collapsed timber with his leg bent wrong beneath a slab of rock, and half the crew standing frozen because none of them had the first idea what to do about a bone snapped clean through skin. Evelyn was in the yard hanging wash when she heard the shouting come down off the mountain. Saw men running, saw Nate's white face as he burst through the trees, calling for bandages, for anything, for whiskey to dull the pain before they moved him. She didn't think. She dropped the wash and ran. By the time she reached the mine entrance, Jed Coulter was gray-faced and shaking his crewmates crowded uselessly around him, one of them trying to press a filthy shirt against a wound that needed a great deal more than pressure alone. "Move," Evelyn said, and something in her voice cut through the panic, sharp enough that the men actually obeyed her, stepping back to let her kneel beside Jed in the dirt. "You ever set a bone before?" Nate asked, low, urgent, kneeling across from her. "My father broke his arm falling off a barn roof when I was 16. I set it myself because the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride, and he'd have bled out from something else entirely if we'd waited on him." She was already tearing the ruined trouser leg away from the wound, assessing with quick, steady hands the same competence she'd once used to catch a lie hiding in a ledger. "It's a clean break, not compound past the skin, thank the Lord for that much. I need 2 straight boards, long as his shin and every strip of clean cloth this camp's got, and whiskey, now." Nobody moved for half a second, still staring at the widow from the tavern, giving orders like a battlefield surgeon. "You heard her," Nate barked, and the men scattered. Jed groaned, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Ma'am, this is going to hurt something fierce, isn't it?" "It's going to hurt like the devil himself," Evelyn said, gentle now, taking his hand in both of hers while they waited for the boards. "But you're going to keep that leg, Mr. Coulter, and you're going to walk on it come spring, and that's a sight better than the alternative, so you hold on to my hand, and you holler as loud as you need to. Nobody here's going to think less of you for it." When the boards came, she set the bone with hands that didn't shake, even once guided by Nate's steady grip, holding Jed's shoulders down. the whole crew watching in a silence that had gone from panic to something closer to awe. Jed screamed once, sharp and terrible, and then it was done, splinted and bound. The danger of a wound gone bad, and a leg gone crooked forever, pushed back by nothing more than a woman who'd once kept a farmer's ledgers and never forgot what she'd learned doing it. "Get him down to the lodge," Nate ordered. "We'll send for the doctor in Silver Ridge come morning, but he's stable enough to wait the night." They carried Jed down the mountain on a makeshift litter, and Evelyn walked alongside the whole way, checking his color, murmuring reassurance. And it wasn't until they'd gotten him settled by the fire in the lodge's front room, Splint holding color returning, that she finally let herself sit down and discovered her hands had started shaking again, the way they always did once the crisis had passed. Nate found her like that in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the table, staring at nothing. "You did good out there," he said. "I know." Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I know I did. It's just—" She looked up at him, something raw and unguarded in her face for once, instead of the careful steadiness she wore like armor. "I haven't done that since my father's arm. I forgot how much it takes out of a person being the calm one while everybody else falls apart." He didn't say anything. He crossed the kitchen, and for the first time since the contract had been signed, since the rule about no touching had been laid down like law, he pulled out the chair beside her and sat close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "You're allowed to fall apart a little too," he said. "Even the calm ones." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to tears. "Is that permission, Mr. Whitaker? Call it an amendment to the contract." His mouth curved, faint but real. "Effective immediately." They sat there together in the firelight a long while, not touching, not quite but close enough that the space between them had shrunk to something that felt less like distance and more like a held breath. Word of what Evelyn had done at the mine reached Silver Ridge faster than either of them expected, and it reached Beaumont faster still. He arrived 3 days later, not with a satchel of falsified papers this time, but with a different kind of weapon altogether. A lawyer from the territorial capital. A thin, nervous man named Pruitt, who kept adjusting his spectacles like they were the only thing anchoring him to the ground. "Mrs. Whitaker's little performance at the mine has made her something of a local legend," Beaumont said, standing in the front room with his hat still on, a deliberate insult Nate's clenched jaw acknowledged without comment. "Practically a saint, from what the miners tell it. Very convenient for a marriage everyone already suspects is nothing but a business arrangement." "Say what you came to say, Beaumont. Mr. Pruitt here represents the Territorial Land Office's interest in verifying household legitimacy claims." Beaumont's smile stretched thinner than ever. "Given the unusual circumstances of your marriage, the speed of it, the tavern origins of your bride, the complete absence of any courtship whatsoever, he'll be conducting an interview. Separately. Standard procedure, of course, in cases where fraud is suspected." Evelyn felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though her face gave nothing away. Separately meant Nate couldn't coach her answers. Separately meant every private word she and Nate had never actually spoken to each other about love. About feelings, about the 6 months and the $200 and the rule against touching would now be tested against whatever careful lies Nate might have told if he'd bothered to prepare any lies at all. "That's a fine trick, Beaumont," Nate said, low and dangerous. "Send a man in here to catch us disagreeing on some detail we never thought to invent, then wave it around as proof of fraud. If it's not fraud, Mr. Whitaker, you've nothing to fear from a few simple questions." Pruitt cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable, being caught between two powerful men who plainly despised each other. "I assure you, this is entirely routine." "It's entirely Beaumont's doing is what it is," Nate said. "And we both know it." Evelyn touched his sleeve the first time she'd touched him since the contract was signed, and something in the gesture made his whole body go still, like a struck bell settling. "Let them ask," she said quietly. "We've nothing to hide, Nate. Let Mr. Pruitt see for himself." She met Nate's eyes and saw the fear there, the specific fear of a man who'd already lost one family and stood now on the edge of watching a second household, however strange and temporary, be torn apart by another man's greed. She held his gaze steady, the same way she'd held it in the tree line, the same way she'd held Grady's over his falsified ledger, and something passed between them that felt for just a moment like a promise neither of them had signed onto paper. "Ask me first," she said to Pruitt. Pruitt led her into the small study off the front room, closing the door behind them, while Nate paced the hallway outside like a caged animal, Beaumont watching him with poorly hidden satisfaction. "Mrs. Whitaker." Pruitt settled his spectacles and pulled a small notebook from his coat. "How did you and Mr. Whitaker meet?" "At Higgins' Tavern in Silver Ridge. I worked there." "And how long did you know him before he proposed marriage?" She could lie. She could invent some tender courtship, some slow romance that would satisfy a man looking for evidence of a real marriage. But she'd learned across 3 years of desperate men and desperate lies that the truth held up under pressure in ways invented stories never could. "I knew him perhaps 4 minutes before he asked me to marry him," she said plainly. "He walked into the tavern, stopped a man from striking me, paid off my debts, and offered me a business arrangement. 6 months room and board and $200 at the end of it, in exchange for standing as his wife. I won't pretend it was romance, Mr. Pruitt, because it wasn't, not at the start." Pruitt's pen paused over his notebook, clearly surprised by the candor. "That's a remarkably honest answer given the circumstances, Mrs. Whitaker." "I've found honesty serves a person better than fine lies in the long run. Ask Mr. Whitaker the same question. I expect you'll hear the very same story because it's simply what happened." "And is there affection between you now? Genuine affection?" The question landed somewhere tender and unguarded, and for once Evelyn found herself without a ready, careful answer. She thought of the fire lit before dark, the coat hung 3 feet closer, the graves in the tree line, the way his hand had found her shoulder just now in the hallway, like an apology he didn't know how to speak aloud. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man doesn't sit beside a woman in his kitchen and tell her she's allowed to fall apart a little if there's nothing real growing between them at all. Whether that's affection or simply the beginning of it, I couldn't say for certain, Mr. Pruitt. I only know it feels a good deal more honest than anything Mr. Beaumont's brought through that door." Pruitt made his notes and called Nate in next. Evelyn waited in the hallway. Beaumont's eyes on her the entire time, cold and calculating, clearly hoping to catch some flicker of panic that would prove his case. She gave him nothing. She'd learned that trick from 3 years of tavern floors and men exactly like him. When Nate emerged 20 minutes later, his face unreadable, Pruitt following behind him with his notebook closed. Beaumont's smile had already begun to falter. "Well?" Beaumont demanded. "The accounts corroborate," Pruitt said, sounding almost apologetic about it. "Every detail matches down to the amount of the debt settled at the tavern. I see no evidence of fraud here, Mr. Beaumont. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'd say this marriage has more genuine feeling behind it than most I've been sent to investigate." Beaumont's face went the color of old ash. "This isn't finished. I believe it is for the territorial office's purposes," Pruitt said, already gathering his things, plainly eager to be gone from whatever was simmering between the two men. Beaumont stood a moment longer, glaring at Nate, at Evelyn, at the fire, crackling warm and stubborn in a hearth that had been cold ash the day she'd arrived. "You're a fool, Whitaker," he said finally, falling for your own hired performance. "Get off my land, Beaumont." Beaumont left Pruitt trailing nervously behind him, and the silence that settled over the lodge once the door shut was different from any silence Evelyn had felt there before. Not empty, not cold, but full taut, humming with something neither of them had named yet. "You lied for me in there?" Nate said quietly. "About the 4 minutes. I didn't lie about anything." She turned to face him closer now than the contract technically allowed, close enough to see the exact moment his careful composure began to crack. "Every word I said was true, Nate. That's what frightens me more than any lie could." Acid. That night, a shot rang out from somewhere down the ridge, far enough to be no immediate threat, close enough to jolt them both from sleep and send Nate running for his rifle, before the echo had even finished rolling off the rock face. They found nothing when they searched, no intruder, no sign of trouble, except hanging from the fence post at the edge of the property. Come morning, a dead crow with a scrap of paper tied to its foot. 3 words scrawled in a hand, neither of them recognized. 6 months ends. Nate's face went hard as granite reading it, and Evelyn felt the cold reach all the way down into her chest, because whoever had left it knew things about the contract that no stranger should have known. Not the amount, not the terms. Nothing except a man desperate enough or connected enough to have gotten his hands on details Beaumont alone possessed. He's not done, Nate said, low furious, crumpling the paper in his fist. Whatever legal tricks he's tried so far, this is something else. This is a threat. Evelyn stared at the dead bird a long moment, feeling the same cold certainty she'd felt reading Beaumont's falsified survey, the same instinct that had once told her a number was lying before her mind had even finished the sum. Then we'd best be ready for whatever comes next, she said, and though her voice held steady, though her spine stayed straight, the way it always did in the face of men who wanted her afraid. Some small, honest part of her understood, standing there in the frozen morning light beside a man she'd agreed to marry for money and nothing more. That the danger circling them now had very little left to do with contracts or land claims at all. It had everything to do with a wall built around a grieving man's heart, and how very close it had already come to falling down. The crow hung there another full day before Nate finally cut it down, himself, burying it out past the tree line, like it deserved a decent send-off, despite everything ugly it had been sent to say. Evelyn watched him do it from the kitchen window, watched the set of his shoulders, and understood that some part of him was burying more than a dead bird. He was burying one more time the fear that came with loving something enough to lose it. "You think it was Beaumont?" she said when he came back inside, stamping the cold off his boots. "I know it was Beaumont." Nate hung his coat with more force than the peg required. "Man doesn't have the stomach to come at us honest anymore, not after Pruitt cleared us. So he sends threats hanging off fence posts instead, hoping to scare us into some mistake he can use. Then we don't make one. Easy to say. Easier to do than you think if you keep your head." She set a cup of coffee in front of him. Steady hands, steady voice. Though her stomach hadn't fully unclenched since she'd found that scrap of paper. "I've been threatened by better men than Charles Beaumont, Nate. Grady stood on my porch not 2 weeks ago promising to ruin me over a debt that never existed. Men like that count on fear doing their work for them. Don't give him the satisfaction." Nate looked at her a long moment over the rim of his cup, something working behind his eyes that hadn't fully surfaced yet. "You say that like fear's a choice. It is." She sat down across from him, closer than the contract technically allowed. Close enough now that neither of them bothered pretending to measure the distance anymore. "Every single day, it's a choice. I choose it 100 times less now than I did 3 years ago. Doesn't mean the fear isn't there. Just means I've stopped letting it drive." Silas rode out at first light to ask around the ridge, quiet questions in quiet places, the kind of asking a man did when he didn't want word getting back to the one being asked about. He returned before noon with his jaw tight and his eyes troubled in a way Evelyn hadn't seen on him before. Feller matching Beaumont's hired man was seen buying rope and a crow trap off old Pemberton 3 days back, Silas said, swinging down off his horse in the yard. "Paid extra to keep quiet about it. Pemberton only told me on account of I once pulled his boy out from under a wagon wheel, and he's owed me a favor since." "That's proof enough for me," Nate said. "Proof enough to know, maybe. Not proof enough to bring before a judge." Silas shook his head grim. "Beaumont's smart, Nate. He's never once left his own hand on anything. Survey papers, hired men, all of it kept far enough off him that even if we catch the fellow who did the dirty work, Beaumont walks clean." Evelyn had been listening from the porch, arms crossed against the cold, and something in her had already started turning the problem over, the way she turned over a column of numbers that refused to balance. "Then we stop trying to catch him doing the wrong thing," she said, "and we start proving what he's already done wrong. That survey, the one with the mismatched dates. If it was falsified once, it was likely falsified more than once. Men who lie about one boundary rarely stop at just the one." Nate's eyes sharpened on her. "You think there's more?" "I think a man desperate enough to hire someone to hang a dead crow off your fence post is a man running low on legal options and high on desperation. Desperate men make mistakes in their paperwork, same as anywhere else. She came down off the porch steps, energy rising in her, now the same sharp focus that had once caught a lying ledger from 4 years of practice. If I could get a look at the full territorial survey record, not just what Beaumont's shown us, I'd wager my last dollar there's a pattern to find. Men like that don't invent a lie once. They build a whole structure of them, and structures like that always have a weak joint somewhere, if you know where to look. The land office is 2 days' ride, and even then, they might not let a woman go rifling through their filings, Nate said. They'll let Mrs. Whitaker, wife of the largest landowner on the northern ridge, request to review filings that concern her own household's legal standing. She lifted her chin, something fierce and unbowed in the gesture. I've been underestimated by better men than a territorial clerk, Nate. Let me try. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not doubt, she realized, but the specific ache of a man watching someone become more essential to him with every single day that passed, when he'd sworn to himself he wouldn't let that happen again. All right, he said finally. We'll ride out at first light. Together. They never made it. The storm came down off the peaks that night, faster than either of them had seen a storm arrive in all their years on that mountain. No gradual gathering of clouds. No polite warning. Just a wall of white slamming into the lodge windows. Before full dark had even settled, wind screaming around the eaves like something with a grudge against the whole structure. We're not riding anywhere in this, Nate said, watching the snow pile against the glass in drifts that grew visibly taller by the minute. Not tomorrow either, most likely. How long does a storm like this usually run? 2 days. Sometimes 3 up this high. He turned from the window, and something in his face had gone tight with an old familiar dread, the specific fear of a man trapped inside walls with a person who mattered to him, while the world outside turned dangerous and unpredictable. You should go on up and bank the fire in your room. No sense both of us freezing down here waiting it out. I'm not tired. She was already moving toward the kitchen, restless energy needing somewhere to go. I'll start supper. Might as well eat well if we're snowed in for it. She was slicing potatoes at the counter 20 minutes later, half listening to the wind howl and half thinking through the tangle of Beaumont's falsified papers, when the knife slipped. It happened fast, the way accidents always did. One moment her hand was steady, the next, the blade had caught the side of her palm, instead of the potato, and blood welled up dark and sudden across her skin. She hissed, more surprised than hurt at first, and pressed her other hand hard against the cut. Evelyn. She hadn't even heard him cross the room. One moment she was alone at the counter, and the next Nate was there, his hands closing around hers, before she'd so much as opened her mouth to tell him it was nothing. Let me see. It's just a nick, Nate. I've cut myself worse peeling apples. Let me see. His voice had dropped into something low and urgent, and when she finally uncurled her fingers, his jaw went tight at the sight of the cut deeper than she'd first thought, blood running steady down her wrist. He didn't hesitate. The same man who'd flinched from touching her for 2 straight weeks, who'd built a contract entirely around the rule that they would never so much as brush hands, crossed to the basin, without a word filled it with water still warm from the stove, and drew her hand into it gentle, as though it might shatter. This is going to sting. I know how a cut works, Nate. Humor me anyway. His thumb moved carefully along the edge of the wound, checking its depth, and Evelyn found herself watching his face instead of her own hand, watching the concentration there, the tenderness he plainly hadn't given himself permission to feel, until circumstance had forced his hand quite literally into hers. He wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth torn from a dish towel, winding it careful and snug. And when he finished, he didn't let go right away. He just stood there, holding her bandaged hand in both of his, and the wind screamed outside the windows, and the fire popped in the hearth, and for one long suspended moment, neither one of them said a single word. Nate, I know. His voice had gone rough. I know what the rule says. Then why haven't you let go of my hand? He looked up at her, and whatever wall had been holding steady behind his eyes for 2 full weeks finally visibly began to give way. "Because I don't want to," he said, quiet, like the admission cost him something enormous. "And I've spent 5 years telling myself I'd never say a sentence like that again as long as I lived." Evelyn's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could feel it through her wrist. "What are you saying, Nathaniel?" "I'm saying the contract's a lie." His thumb traced once gentle along the back of her uninjured hand. "Not the marriage part. The part where I told you there'd be no feelings. There's feelings, Evelyn. There have been feelings since you set my kitchen table straight without being asked, and I've been fighting them so hard I forgot how tired a man gets fighting something he doesn't actually want to win." She didn't move. She barely breathed. "I've been fighting the same thing," she admitted. "Every single day. Telling myself 6 months and $200, and none of this is real. And then you hang your coat 3 feet closer to the kitchen, and I forget every word of my own argument." The wind howled. The fire cracked. And for the first time since she'd walked through the door of that cold, empty lodge, Nathaniel Whitaker leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. Not quite a kiss, not yet, but close enough that she could feel his breath unsteady against her cheek. "I made those rules to protect myself," he said. "Not you, never you. I was just too much of a coward to say so." "You're not a coward, Nate. You buried a wife and a daughter, and you got up every single morning after and kept this whole mountain running. That's not cowardice. That's the opposite of it." His hand came up slow, careful, like he still expected her to pull away, and cupped the side of her face. "Evelyn Carter," he murmured. "I don't know what I did to deserve a woman like you walking through my door. But I'm done pretending I don't want you to stay past 6 months." She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes, and for just a moment, just one single suspended moment, before the world came crashing back in. There was nothing between them at all, but warmth and honesty, and the sound of a storm raging safely outside, instead of inside, where it had lived for 5 long years. The knock came at the worst possible time, hard and urgent against the front door, audible even over the shrieking wind. Nate's head snapped up first, every soft line in his face, hardening instantly back into wariness. Nobody rides in this storm unless something's wrong. He crossed to the door with Evelyn close behind him, and when he hauled it open, the wind nearly tore it from his grip. Snow blasting into the front room, along with the shivering, half-frozen shape of a man Evelyn recognized after a moment as Pruitt, the territorial lawyer, his fine coat soaked through his spectacles, nearly frosted opaque. "Mr. Pruitt!" Nate hauled him inside and shut the door hard against the storm. "What in God's name are you doing out in this Beaumont?" Pruitt's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely get the word out. "He's filed again. Emergency petition claims new evidence of fraud wants an immediate hearing before the marriage can be further legitimized by time. Judge Kellerman's riding up from the county seat himself, storm or no storm, on account of Beaumont's greased enough palms to make it happen fast." Evelyn felt ice settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "New evidence. What new evidence?" "He wouldn't say to me, but he's confident, Mrs. Whitaker. Confident in a way that worries me." Pruitt accepted the blanket Evelyn draped over his shoulders with a grateful, shivering nod. "I rode ahead to warn you both. Judge Kellerman will be another day behind me, weather permitting. I thought you deserved warning before he arrives with whatever Beaumont's cooked up." Nate's jaw had gone tight as a drawn bowstring. "He's been planning this the whole time. The crow, the threats, all of it was just softening us up before the real blow landed." "That would be my read of it as well," Pruitt admitted. Evelyn's mind was already racing ahead, sorting through everything she knew, everything she'd caught in Beaumont's papers, everything Silas had learned from old Pemberton. "Mr. Pruitt, does the Territorial Land Office keep survey records dating back further than this current dispute, say 5 years or more?" "They ought to, yes. Why?" "Because I believe Charles Beaumont has been falsifying boundary surveys for a good deal longer than just this one dispute with Nate's property, and if I'm right, There's a pattern buried in those records that would ruin him a great deal more thoroughly than any fraud charge he's trying to invent against us." She looked between the two men steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. "The trouble is, we're snowed in, and Judge Kellerman's a day out. And whatever new evidence Beaumont's built, we'll be walking into that hearing blind, unless somebody can get word down to Silver Ridge before he does." "I could try," Silas said from the doorway, having come in from the barn covered in snow, having plainly heard enough of the conversation to understand the stakes. "I know these trails better than most storm or no storm." "It's a death ride in this weather, Silas," Nate said. "Wouldn't be the first time I outrode worse for less reason." Silas was already shrugging his coat back on, resolute in the particular way of a man who'd made his decision before anyone finished arguing against it. "You need them old survey records, Mrs. Whitaker. Tell me what to look for, and I'll bring back whatever the clerk'll let me copy." Evelyn crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, tore a sheet of paper free, and wrote fast and precise the exact boundary markers she needed, checked the exact dates that ought to be compared against filing records. The specific pattern of discrepancy she suspected Beaumont had built his fortune on. Ask for every survey filed under Beaumont's name or his known associates going back to 1868, she said, pressing the paper into Silas's hands. Compare filing dates against the physical placement dates of the boundary markers themselves. If I'm right, you'll find at least 3, maybe more, where the marker was moved after the survey was already filed and approved. That's not a clerical error, Silas. That's a man building his empire on stolen ground, one falsified inch at a time. Silas tucked the paper inside his coat, nodded once, and was gone into the howling white before anyone could say another word of caution. The waiting was its own particular torment. Pruitt slept fitful hours by the fire, worn thin from his ride. Nate paced the front room until Evelyn finally caught his sleeve and pulled him to sit, and even then his knee bounced with restless, coiled energy that had nowhere else to go. "He's not going to find anything," Nate said low, more to himself than to her. "And even if he does, Kellerman might not care. Judges get bought same as clerks do, and Beaumont's got more money than sense when it comes to buying what he wants. Then we'll fight it a different way." Evelyn's bandaged hand found his steady, certain no hesitation left in the gesture at all, now that the rule between them had already broken wide open. "You didn't survive 5 years alone on this mountain by giving up the first time the ground shifted under you, Nathaniel. I didn't survive 3 years on that tavern floor by folding the second a man like Beaumont raised his voice. We're not made that way, either one of us." He turned his hand over beneath hers, lacing their fingers together, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. Something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the careful wariness of the first week. Not even the raw grief from the tree line, but something steadier. Something that looked unmistakably like hope. A man had convinced himself he'd never be foolish enough to feel again. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. This wasn't ever really about the land for me, not entirely. Beaumont's been circling that excuse for months, looking for any crack to squeeze his fingers into. But you—" His thumb moved over her knuckles, slow, reverent. "You walked in and made this place feel like a home again in 2 weeks flat, something I couldn't manage in 5 years on my own. Whatever that judge decides tomorrow, I don't want you thinking for one moment that any of this was pretend on my end. Not anymore. Maybe not ever, if I'm honest with myself." Evelyn's eyes stung, and she blinked hard against it, refusing to let the tears fall. Not now. Not with so much still hanging in the balance. "I stopped pretending somewhere around the mine accident," she admitted. "Maybe before that. Maybe the very first night when I found you standing over those 2 graves and realized what kind of man builds a fortune just so he never has to feel anything ever again, and does it anyway every single day because giving up was never really in him." The wind howled outside. The fire cracked low and steady, and somewhere on a mountain trail buried in snow, a weathered foreman rode through the dark on a mission that might save everything they'd built together in 2 short weeks, or lose it all before it had even properly begun. Silas returned the following afternoon, half-frozen, his horse lathered and staggering, but with a leather satchel clutched against his chest like it held the crown jewels of the territory itself. "Got it," he rasped, nearly falling out of the saddle before Nate caught him. "Clerk near froze solid, same as me, but I paid him enough to let me copy every filing under Beaumont's name back to '68. Mrs. Whitaker, I think you were righter than you knew." Evelyn spread the papers across the kitchen table, with hands that shook, not from cold this time, but from the particular electric focus that had once made her the best bookkeeper her husband ever employed, back when her husband had still been alive to employ her at anything at all. Nate and Pruitt crowded close, watching her trace columns of figures and dates with a sharpened pencil, murmuring calculations under her breath. There. Her finger stabbed down on a filing dated 1871. Boundary marker placed in June, survey filed in April, 2 full months before the marker even existed. And here, another paper, another date circled hard enough to tear the page. 1872, same pattern. And again in 73. Pruitt leaned in, adjusting his spectacles, his professional composure visibly cracking as he followed her calculations. Good Lord. If this holds up under scrutiny, Mrs. Whitaker, this isn't just fraud regarding your husband's property. This is a 5-year pattern of stolen land, dozens of parcels, possibly the entire foundation of Beaumont's fortune, built on falsified surveys. I told you, desperate men build whole structures out of their lies, Evelyn said, and despite the exhaustion pulling at every line of her face, there was something fierce and satisfied in her voice. Structures like that always have a weak joint, Mr. Pruitt. We just found his. Nate was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not gratitude, not even admiration, but something closer to awe. The specific wonder of a man watching someone dismantle, in a single afternoon, a threat that had been circling him for months. You just saved this entire mountain, he said quietly. We saved it, she corrected. Silas rode through a blizzard for it. You built the fortune worth saving. I just happened to be very good at reading numbers. Other people hoped nobody would ever check. Judge Kellerman arrived the following morning, the storm finally breaking into a hard, brilliant cold that made every icicle on the eaves glitter like glass. He was an older man, weathered by decades on the territorial bench, and Beaumont trailed in behind him, wearing the particular smug confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. They gathered in the front room, the very room where Nate had once forbidden Evelyn from touching a dead wife's shawl, transformed now into a makeshift courtroom with the fire blazing and every one of Beaumont's careful lies about to come apart at the seams. Judge Kellerman, Beaumont began, all oily confidence. I've brought new evidence proving conclusively that this marriage was arranged solely to circumvent territorial land claims, a fraud perpetrated. Before you continue, Mr. Beaumont, Judge Kellerman said, settling heavily into the chair Nate had offered him. I understand Mrs. Whitaker has some evidence of her own she'd like entered into record first. Beaumont's confidence flickered just slightly. Your Honor, surely, my petition takes precedence. Your petition can wait its turn, same as anybody else's, Mr. Beaumont. Mrs. Whitaker. Evelyn stepped forward, her spine straight, her bandaged hand steady around the leather satchel Silas had risked his life to bring back down that mountain. Your Honor, I'd like to submit copies of survey filings and boundary marker placement records spanning 1868 through the present, all filed under Mr. Beaumont's name or the names of his known associates. She laid the papers before him, walked him through the pattern with the same clear, unhesitating precision she'd once used to catch a lying number in her late husband's freight accounts, and watched Judge Kellerman's expression shift slowly, inexorably, from polite attention to genuine alarm. This is a 5-year fraud, the judge said finally, looking up at Beaumont with an expression that had gone cold as the ice outside. Not just against Mr. Whitaker's property, against half the parcels on this ridge if these records hold up. Those figures are... Beaumont's voice had lost its smooth confidence entirely. They're circumstantial, easily misread by someone without proper training. I've spent 4 years managing my late husband's freight accounts, Mr. Beaumont, and every figure in that ledger balanced to the penny under my watch. Evelyn said. And there was nothing soft in her voice now, nothing that gave him any room to dismiss her as some hysterical widow, grasping at desperate excuses. I know precisely what proper training looks like. I'd wager Judge Kellerman's territorial surveyors will find exactly what I found should he order a formal review. Judge Kellerman was already gathering the papers, his face set hard. I believe I will, Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Beaumont, your petition regarding this marriage is dismissed effective immediately. I'd advise you retain a lawyer of your own post haste, because I intend to order a full territorial investigation into every survey filed under your name going back 7 years. Beaumont stood frozen a long moment, his whole carefully constructed world visibly collapsing behind his eyes, and then something ugly and desperate broke loose across his face. This isn't over, he hissed first at the judge, then swinging toward Nate and Evelyn both. You think a few papers save you? I built half this territory. Whitaker and I won't watch some tavern girl and her borrowed husband tear it down over a technicality. It's not a technicality, Mr. Beaumont, Evelyn said, calm as still water even as her heart hammered in her chest. It's the truth. You've simply never had to answer to it before. Beaumont's eyes, when they landed on her, held something colder than mere anger, now something that made the hair on the back of her neck rise despite the fire blazing warm behind her. You'll regret this, he said low, meant for her alone. Both of you will. He stormed out into the cold without another word, Pruitt trailing after him with an expression of profound professional relief, and Judge Kellerman rose stiffly, gathering the evidence with care. I'll see this filed proper the moment I'm back at the county seat, he said. You've done this territory a considerable service today, Mrs. Whitaker. Man's been robbing folks blind for years, and nobody thought to check his arithmetic. Nobody thought a tavern girl could check it either, Evelyn said, and something like a smile flickered at the corner of the judge's weathered mouth. Well, folks are fools sometimes about who they underestimate. He left, and the front room fell quiet, the fire crackling steady, and Nate turned to her, slowly disbelief and relief, and something far warmer than either fighting for space across his face. You just beat him, he said. Beaumont, 5 years of fraud and you unraveled it in one storm. We beat him, Evelyn corrected again, though her voice had gone soft now, exhaustion and triumph tangled together. But Nate, She hesitated, the weight of Beaumont's parting words settling cold in her chest, despite the victory. He didn't sound like a man who'd given up. He sounded like a man about to do something a great deal worse than falsify a survey. Nate's jaw tightened, the brief warmth of victory already darkening at the edges, with old familiar wariness. Then we'd best be ready for it, he said, echoing her own words from days before, and reached for her hand. Not carefully this time, not like a man testing broken rules, but certain, unhesitating, the grip of a man who had already decided exactly what he stood to lose and exactly how hard he intended to fight before he let it happen. Outside, the last of the storm cleared from the peaks, sunlight breaking hard and bright across snow deep enough to bury a man's boots to the knee. Somewhere down that mountain, Charles Beaumont was riding away with his empire crumbling behind him and nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose. Evelyn understood with a cold certainty settling deep in her chest was the most dangerous kind of man there was. The morning after Judge Kellerman rode off with his satchel of evidence, Nate found Evelyn already awake before him, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and a look on her face that told him she hadn't slept much either. You heard him too, she said without looking up. Beaumont, the way he said it wasn't over. I heard him. Nate poured himself a cup and sat across from her, close now, no careful distance left between the two chairs. Man like that doesn't threaten idle. He's got nothing left to lose but pride, and pride's the most dangerous thing a rich man can lose. What do? We watch, we wait, and we don't hand him a single crack to slip through. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his steady, certain none of the hesitation that had marked those first careful weeks. I already lost people to trouble I didn't see coming, Evelyn. I don't intend to make that mistake twice. She turned her hand over beneath his, lacing their fingers together the way they'd started doing without either one of them remarking on it, like it had simply always been the natural shape of things. Then we watched together, she said. I'm done being the one who waits inside while the danger happens to somebody else. Dig. Trouble found them 3 days later, and it found them small at first, the way real trouble often did, before it grew teeth. Silas came down from the mine at midday, with his face set hard, holding a length of chain that had been cut clean through, not snapped, not worn cut. Found this on the ore cart winch, he said, laying it on the table like evidence at a trial. Somebody took a hacksaw to it sometime in the night. If that cart had been loaded and running when it gave, we'd have had men crushed under a ton of rock before anybody had time to shout a warning. Nate's jaw went tight as granite. Any sign of who? None I could find. Whoever did it knew enough to come and go without leaving tracks a man could follow. That's not some drunk miner with a grudge, Nate. That's somebody who's done this kind of work before. Evelyn's stomach turned cold. Beaumont wouldn't dirty his own hands with a hacksaw. No, Silas agreed. But he's got money enough to hire a man who would. That evening, Nate doubled the watch at the mine entrance and set 2 men patrolling the property line through the night, and still none of them slept easy, jumping at every creak of the old lodge, settling against the cold. Evelyn lay awake in her room, listening to the wind running through every possibility Beaumont might reach for next, and found herself sometime past midnight, padding down the hallway to the room Nate had taken to leaving, his door cracked open, as though some part of him needed to know she was still safely under his roof before he could rest either. Can't sleep. His voice came low out of the dark before she'd even said a word. No. She stood in the doorway wrapped in a shawl of her own, not Margaret's one she'd stitched herself from the wool she'd bought in town. I keep thinking about that chain, about what it means that he's willing to hurt men who've got nothing to do with any of this just to get at us. Nate sat up, the moonlight catching the hard lines of worry etched into his face. Come here. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, and he pulled her against his side. Not urgent, not anything close to improper, just the simple comfort of 2 people who'd stopped pretending they didn't need it. I won't let him hurt you, he said into her hair. Whatever else happens, Evelyn, I need you to know that. You can't promise a thing like that, Nate. Nobody can. No, he admitted. But I can promise I'll spend every last breath trying. The second warning came 4 days after the first, and it came aimed squarely at Evelyn, rather than at the mine. She'd ridden into Silver Ridge for supplies again, Silas at her side same as before, and had just stepped out of the mercantile with a parcel of flour under one arm, when a man she didn't recognize stepped directly into her path, blocking the boardwalk. Mrs. Whitaker? He tipped his hat with mocking politeness, a lean, hard-eyed man with a scar cutting through one eyebrow. Heard you're quite the bookkeeper. Heard you cost a certain gentleman a great deal of money and a great deal of pride. I don't believe we've been introduced. No need for introductions, just a message. He leaned in close enough that she caught the whiskey on his breath, close enough that Silas's hand dropped instantly to the pistol at his hip. Man who crosses Charles Beaumont don't usually get to walk away clean. You've been lucky so far. Luck's got a way of running dry. Is that a threat, mister? Silas's voice had gone flat and dangerous. Just a bit of friendly advice. The man's eyes never left Evelyn's face. Woman ought to know when to stop poking her nose in men's business before somebody decides to teach her different. Evelyn's heart was hammering, but she'd learned across 3 years of Grady, and worse exactly how a man like this fed on visible fear, and she refused with every ounce of will she had left to give him a single crumb of it. You tell Mr. Beaumont, she said steady as she could make her voice, that I've faced down drunk miners twice your size and territorial judges holding my whole future in their hands, and I didn't flinch for either one. I certainly don't intend to start flinching for a hired man, too much of a coward to give his own name. Something flickered across the stranger's face. Surprise, maybe even the faint edge of respect, before it hardened back into menace. Brave words, ma'am. We'll see how brave you are when it's not just words coming your way. He melted back into the crowd on the boardwalk before Silas could do more than half draw his pistol, and Evelyn stood there shaking the tremor arriving late as it always did, once the danger had already passed, and there was nothing left to do but feel the full weight of how close it had come. "We're riding back to the lodge," Silas said grimly. "Now. And I'm telling Nate every word of that." Nate's reaction when he heard it was worse than Evelyn had braced for. That's it. He was already reaching for his rifle, already moving toward the door with a fury she'd never seen in him before, not even facing Beaumont directly in his own front room. "I'm riding down there and putting an end to this myself." "Nate, stop." Evelyn caught his arm, planting herself directly in his path. "That's exactly what he wants. A reason to call the law on you, to paint you as a violent man threatening a respected landowner. Don't hand him that gift." "He threatened you." "He threatened me with words, Nate, same as Grady's threatened me with words for 3 years running. Words I can survive. You riding down there with a rifle and doing something you can't take back that I'm not sure either one of us survives." She held his gaze fierce and unflinching until she felt some of the wildness in him begin to settle. "We beat him with paper once. We beat him with the truth. Let's beat him that way again, not by giving him the violence he's clearly hoping to provoke." Nate's chest heaved, fury and fear tangled together in a way that made him look for just a moment achingly young, like a man who'd learned the hard way exactly how fast the ground could open up beneath everything he loved. "I can't lose you," he said, rough raw. "I already know what that feels like, Evelyn. I won't survive it twice. You're not going to lose me." She pulled him close, both arms around him now, no hesitation left in the gesture at all. "I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel Whitaker. Not for Beaumont, not for his hired men, not for anybody. You hear me?" He held on to her like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had started shifting dangerously beneath his feet again, and for a long moment, neither one of them said anything at all, just breathed together, steady, present, refusing to let fear win the ground. It was so plainly hungry for. It was Silas, 3 days later, who uncovered the piece that finally made sense of everything. He came riding hard into the yard, just past dusk, dismounting before his horse had even fully stopped, his face a mixture of triumph and grim fury that told Evelyn immediately something significant had broken loose. "Grady," he said, breathless. "Your moneylender back in town, Mrs. Whitaker. Turns out he's been in Beaumont's pocket the whole while." Evelyn's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I finally got old Pemberton talking proper, and he let slip that Grady's been receiving payments from Beaumont going back better than a year now. That fake note he tried to lay on you, the one about your husband's debt, Beaumont put him up to it. Whole thing was meant to squeeze you for money you didn't owe. Soften you up. Maybe drive a wedge between you and Nate before the marriage even had a chance to take root. That's why he came at me first," Evelyn said slowly, the pieces falling into place with the same cold clarity she'd once used on Beaumont's falsified survey. "Before the crow, before the hearing, even before I'd fully settled into this house. Grady was the opening move. Beaumont's been planning this a great deal longer than any of us realized." Nate's face had gone hard as flint. "And now that his legal tricks have failed, and his hired man's threats haven't worked, what's his next move?" Nobody had an answer for that. And the not knowing sat heavy and cold in the room, long after Silas had gone to see to the horses, long after the fire had burned down to embers, long after Evelyn had finally convinced herself to try for sleep she knew wouldn't come easy. The explosion came just before dawn, and it came without any warning at all. Evelyn woke to a sound she felt in her chest before she fully registered it in her ears, a deep, rolling boom that shook the windows in their frames and sent her bolting upright in bed, heart already hammering before her mind had caught up to what was happening. "Nate!" She was in the hallway before she'd finished shouting his name and found him already there, pulling on his boots with shaking hands, his face gone white as bone. "The mine," he said. "That came from the mine." They ran, both of them together, out into the freezing pre-dawn dark, following the acrid smell of smoke and the distant sound of shouting up the trail toward the mine entrance, where a scene of chaos had already begun to unfold. Men stumbling out of the smoke-choked entrance, coughing, calling names into the dark. A section of the timber support structure visibly collapsed inward where it had been sound and solid just hours before. "Nate went in," one of the miners shouted, seeing them approach. "Went in after Coulter's boy. The new one kid wasn't supposed to be on shift, but he'd swapped with—" Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Nate's inside. But it was too late to ask more, because at that exact moment, a second, smaller collapse rumbled somewhere deep in the mine's throat, and dust billowed out of the entrance in a choking cloud, and every man standing in that yard went dead silent, waiting, praying for some sign of the two men who'd gone in and not yet come back out. Nate. Evelyn was moving toward the entrance before Silas's arm caught her hard around the waist, hauling her back. "You can't go in there, ma'am. You'll bring the whole thing down worse." "Let me go, Silas. He's in there. I know he's in there. Screaming after him won't dig him out any faster." Silas's voice cracked fear plain beneath the command in it. "Give the men room to work. Please, Evelyn." She forced herself. Still forced her breathing to slow, every instinct in her screaming to run headlong into that smoke after the man she loved, and made herself instead do the only useful thing left to her. Think clearly fast, the way she'd learned to think under pressure her whole hard life. How many men do we have who can dig? 8, maybe 10, once we rouse the ones still sleeping. Then get them digging from the second entrance, the old shaft on the east face. The one Nate mentioned once connects to the main tunnel near where the boy would have been working. She was already moving toward the tool shed as she spoke, grabbing lanterns, grabbing rope. If the main entrance is blocked, we go around it. We are not standing here waiting while he suffocates under a mountain. Silas Boone, do you understand me? Something in her voice, fierce and absolute, cut through the panic gripping the yard, and men who'd been standing frozen suddenly found direction, found purpose, found the specific relief of having someone tell them exactly what to do when their own minds had gone blank with fear. They dug. Evelyn dug alongside them, her bandaged hand from weeks before. Nothing compared to the raw blisters rising. Now refusing every offer to step back and rest. Refusing every gentle suggestion that a lady oughtn't be swinging a pick in the freezing dark. She'd stopped being a lady who waited politely for news the moment she'd heard Nate had gone into that mountain, and she wasn't about to start again now. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of digging, of shouting into the rubble, and listening for any answer of Evelyn's heart climbing higher into her throat with every silent minute that passed until finally a shout went up from deep in the newly cleared shaft. "Found them! They're alive, both of them, but Nate's hurt bad." They carried him out on a makeshift litter, and the sight of him nearly buckled Evelyn's knees entirely, his face gray beneath the coal dust and blood, a gash torn deep along his temple. His left arm bent at an angle that told her even before she reached him that the bone beneath it had snapped clean through. "Nate." She dropped to her knees beside the litter hands, hovering desperate to touch him and terrified of hurting him further. "Nate, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered unfocused, then found her face, and something in them cleared just slightly at the sight of her. "Evelyn." His voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. "Kid. Get the kid out." "He's out, Nate. He's alive. You got him out before the second collapse. You did it." She was crying now. She realized distantly tears cutting tracks through the dust and cold on her face, and she didn't care, didn't have room left in her to care about anything except the man bleeding in front of her. "You're going to be all right. I need you to be all right." "Arms broke." He managed half a laugh, half a groan of pain. "Guess I finally know how it feels. Don't you dare joke right now, Nathaniel Whitaker." But her hands were already moving, already assessing the same steady competence that had once set Jed Coulter's leg taking over, now even through her own terror. "Silas, I need those same boards from before, and clean cloth, and get him inside where it's warm now." They carried him back down to the lodge, and Evelyn worked through the rest of that terrible morning, with a focus that left no room for the fear trying to claw its way up through her chest. Cleaning the gash along his temple, setting the broken arm with hands that shook only slightly, binding ribs that had taken a hard blow from falling rock, forcing broth into him when he was lucid enough to swallow it. It was well past noon before she finally let herself sit down beside his bed. Exhaustion and delayed terror crashing over her all at once. And it was there that Nate, drifting in and out of pain-fogged sleep, caught her hand in his good one and held on. "You could have left," he murmured, barely awake. "Storm cleared. Roads open. You could have taken your $200 and gone anywhere once Beaumont's threat passed. Instead, you're sitting here covered in mine dust, patching me up like I'm worth the trouble." "You are worth the trouble," she said fiercely, her voice breaking on the words. "I came here as a paid wife, Nate. 6 months, $200, no feelings, no touching. That's what the contract said. But I stayed because somewhere between the first fire I lit in that cold hearth and pulling you out of that collapsed mine, you stopped being a job and started being my family. I don't leave family. Not for money, not for danger, not for anything." His hand tightened around hers, and though his eyes were heavy with pain and exhaustion, they were also unmistakably wet. "I love you," he said, simple, unguarded, the words of a man too tired and too raw to keep them locked behind his walls a moment longer. "I've loved you since you set my kitchen table straight and told me I hung my coat on the wrong peg without ever once saying it out loud. I should have told you sooner." Evelyn pressed her lips to his knuckles, tears falling freely now. No reason left to hold them back. "I love you too, Nathaniel Whitaker. God help me, I think I have since that very first night in the tavern when you looked at me like I was something worth saving instead of something to be used." He slept through most of the following day, fever rising and breaking in restless waves, and Evelyn barely left his side, catching what rest she could in the chair beside his bed, jolting awake at every murmur or shift of his weight against the pillows. It was Silas who finally brought the news that confirmed what all of them had already suspected in their bones. "That collapse wasn't natural," he said grimly, standing in the doorway of Nate's room, voice pitched low so as not to disturb him. "I went through the timber myself once the dust settled. Same clean cuts as that winch chain. Somebody weakened those support beams on purpose, timed it for the early shift, when the mine'd be at its fullest." Evelyn's hands curled into fists in her lap. "Beaumont. Can't prove it. Not yet. But it's got his fingerprints all over it, same careful, cowardly distance he's kept from every other move he's made against you both." Silas's jaw was tight with a fury Evelyn had never seen on the normally steady foreman. "He tried to kill Nate, ma'am. And that boy who swapped shifts and half the crew who could have been on that floor when it went. This ain't about land claims anymore. This is a man trying to murder his way to what he wants. Then we stopped trying to beat him with paper," Evelyn said, and something cold and resolute had settled into her voice, the last soft edges of fear burning away into something harder, sharper. "A man willing to collapse a mine on sleeping miners isn't a man who's going to be stopped by a judge's ruling, Silas. We need to be ready for whatever he tries next, because I promise you he's not finished. Not after failing this badly, this publicly. What do you propose?" Evelyn looked back at Nate, asleep and pale against the pillows, his broken arm bound tight, his breathing shallow but steady, and felt something fierce and unbreakable settle into the center of her chest. The exact opposite of the desperate, hunted feeling that had once driven her to accept a stranger's marriage proposal off a tavern floor. "We protect what's ours," she said, "whatever it takes." Word came 2 days later, carried up the mountain by a breathless rider who'd nearly killed his horse, getting there fast enough. Charles Beaumont had fled Silver Ridge in the dead of night. His properties abandoned, his accounts at the Territorial Bank drained to nothing. His hired men scattered to the wind now that the money paying them had vanished. Coward ran the moment he heard the territorial investigators were riding out to serve him papers. The rider reported, still catching his breath in the yard. "Judge Kellerman's ordered a full search of every property he owns. Word in town is there's enough evidence in his own files to hang him 3 times over for fraud alone. Never mind whatever they find connecting him to that mine collapse." Nate propped up in a chair by the fire, now his arm still splinted, but his color returned. Listened to the news with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Relief certainly, but something wearier beneath it too. The particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent months bracing for violence that had finally run its course. "He's gone," Nate said slowly, like he didn't quite trust the words yet. "Truly gone." "Gone doesn't mean safe," Evelyn cautioned. though hope had already begun creeping into her own chest, despite every hard lesson she'd learned about trusting good news too quickly. A man that desperate, that cowardly might still try something from wherever he's run to. Maybe. Nate reached for her hand, his grip still weaker than it had been before the collapse, but steady, certain. But I've spent 5 years letting fear run this house, Evelyn. Fear of losing what I loved. Fear of letting anybody close enough to matter. I nearly lost my life in that mine. And you know what I thought about buried under all that rock waiting to be dug out? What? You? Just you. Not the mine, not Beaumont, not any of it. I thought about how much I hadn't told you yet, how much time I'd wasted being careful when I should have been loving you with everything I had from the very first week. His thumb traced slow circles over her knuckles. I'm done being careful. Beaumont ran off into whatever hole he's crawled into, and if he wants to keep running, let him run. I'm not spending one more day of whatever time I've got left guarding my heart against the very thing that's finally made it worth guarding. Evelyn's eyes filled, and this time she let the tears fall freely, kneeling beside his chair and resting her head against his good shoulder, while his uninjured hand came up to stroke her hair. Gentle, reverent. A man finally fully unafraid to hold on to something precious. I never expected any of this, she admitted quietly. Not when you walked into that tavern and offered me a contract instead of courtship. I thought I was agreeing to survive 6 months, Nate. I never once imagined I'd come out the other side of it with a whole life I actually wanted to keep. Neither did I. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, careful, tender. But here we are anyway. Whatever's left of Beaumont's schemes, whatever trouble still comes looking for us, we'll face it together. That much I promise you, contract or no contract. Outside, the last of winter's hard grip had begun to loosen its hold on the mountain sunlight, breaking clean and bright across snow, beginning finally to melt. But even as hope settled warm into the lodge for the first time in months, Evelyn couldn't quite shake the cold. Certain feeling curled deep in her chest that a man like Charles Beaumont, stripped of everything he'd built and humiliated before the entire territory, wasn't the kind to simply vanish quietly into whatever darkness had swallowed him. Men like that didn't run from a fight. They only ever ran long enough to sharpen their knives for one very last, very desperate attempt to take back everything they believed had been stolen from them. And somewhere out there, past the melting snow and the mountain's long shadow, Charles Beaumont was almost certainly doing exactly that. The days that followed the mine collapse settled into something Evelyn hadn't dared hope for in weeks, a fragile, hard-won quiet. Nate's arm mended slow but steady. The color returned proper to his face, and the lodge, once a fortress built to keep the world out, had become instead a place two people were building together, brick by brick, choice by choice. But quiet, in Evelyn's experience, was rarely a thing to be trusted for long. It was Silas who broke it riding into the yard on a morning bright enough to fool a person into believing winter had finally loosened its grip for good. His face, when Evelyn caught sight of it from the porch, told her everything before he'd said a single word. "Beaumont's back," he said, swinging down off his horse. "Seen crossing the county line late last night, riding hard, 4 men with him I didn't recognize. Hired guns by the look of their saddles. Not miners, not ranch hands. Men paid to do exactly one kind of work." Nate came out onto the porch at the sound of voices, his splinted arm still bound tight against his chest, his face going hard as the news landed. "He's out of money, out of land, out of every legal trick he's got left, which means he's got nothing left to lose." Evelyn finished the cold certainty she'd carried since the collapse, finally fully confirmed. A desperate man with hired guns and nothing left to protect isn't looking to file another petition, Nate. He's looking to take by force what the law already told him he can't have. "Then we get you off this mountain," Nate said immediately. "Down to Silver Ridge somewhere safe, while Silas and I—" "No." Evelyn's voice came out sharp enough that both men turned to look at her fully. "I didn't run from Grady. I didn't run from Beaumont's lawyer, or his hired man on the boardwalk, or a dead crow hanging off a fence post. I am not running now, Nathaniel Whitaker, and you'd do well to remember exactly who you're talking to before you suggest it again. Nate's jaw worked torn between the fierce protective instinct of a man who'd already buried one family and the plain undeniable truth that the woman standing in front of him had never once needed rescuing in all the months he'd known her. "All right," he said, finally quiet. "Then we make this house ready for whatever he brings." They worked through the day, with the particular grim efficiency of people who understood without needing to say it aloud that the next visit from Charles Beaumont would not come with papers or lawyers or careful legal threats. Silas rode out to gather every hand from the mine willing to stand watch men who'd worked under Nate for years and had no love left for the man who'd tried to bury half of them alive in a collapsed shaft. Nate, one-armed and stubborn, oversaw the barring of every window on the ground floor, despite Evelyn's protests that he ought to be resting. "I've rested enough," he said, hauling a heavy shutter into place with his good arm, while Evelyn held it steady. A man doesn't rest easy knowing trouble's riding toward the people he loves. "You'll tear that arm open again. Then I'll tear it open, protecting what matters, instead of lying in bed, wondering if it's already too late." He caught her hand once the shutter was fixed, held it a moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with the danger circling closer by the hour. "I need you to promise me something." "I don't make promises I can't keep, Nate." "Then promise me this. If it comes to it, if Beaumont's men breach this house, you get to the root cellar and you bar that door and you do not come out for anything. Not for me, not for Silas, not for anybody, until somebody you trust with your whole heart tells you it's safe." Evelyn held his gaze steady, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "And if it's you who needs help down there, then you'll have already done the smartest thing either one of us could do, which is keep yourself alive long enough for this whole mess to end one way or the other." His voice cracked slightly on the words, the raw fear beneath his composure finally showing through. "I can't lose you, Evelyn. I've said it before, and I'll say it again as many times as it takes until you understand. I mean it clear down to the bone. Please, for me." She thought of every reckless, brave thing she'd already done to protect this life they'd built together. The ledger she'd caught the fraud, she'd unraveled the mine, she'd dug her own hands raw, helping to clear. But she thought too of the 2 small graves in the tree line of a man who'd already lost everything once and rebuilt himself into something hard and cold, rather than face that particular grief again. "All right," she said finally. "I promise. But Nate, if it comes to it and there's a way I can help without breaking that promise, I'm taking it. I won't sit useless in a root cellar while people I love are fighting for their lives up above me. That much I can't promise away." He pressed his forehead against hers, the same gesture from that storm-locked night, weeks before, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just breathed together, steady present, gathering whatever courage they had left for whatever the coming night might bring. Beaumont came at dusk exactly as men like him always did, when the light was uncertain, and shadows could hide whatever cowardice a person didn't want witnessed. Evelyn heard the horses first, a dozen or more by the sound of its hooves drumming up the trail toward the lodge with none of the careful pace of a man come to talk. She was at the window before Nate even called out the warning, watching torchlight bob and weave through the trees, watching 4, 5, 6 riders emerge into the clearing with rifles slung and faces set hard. Charles Beaumont rode at the front of them, and the man who dismounted in the yard bore little resemblance to the smooth, oily landowner who'd once strolled uninvited into Nate's front room waving falsified survey papers. This Beaumont was gaunt, wild-eyed, dressed in clothes that had plainly gone days without proper care, a man who'd watched his entire fortune collapse and had nothing left in him but the raw, ugly desperation of someone with everything to prove and nothing left to lose. Whitaker. His voice cracked across the yard, half command, half plea. "Come out here and face me like a man, or I burn this whole place down around your ears." Nate was already moving toward the door, and Evelyn caught his good arm hard. "Don't. That's exactly what he wants, to draw you out into the open where his men have the advantage. I'm not letting him threaten to burn this house down without answering him." "Then answer him from here." She was already moving to the window, positioning herself, where she could see without being seen the same sharp tactical focus, that had once caught a lying ledger now turned toward something far more dangerous than numbers. Silas. How many men do we have positioned? 6, ma'am, spread along the tree line and the barn roof, same as we planned. Good. Nobody fires unless they fire first. We don't give him an excuse to call this self-defense on his part. Nate stared at her, something between fear and awe crossing his face even in the middle of the crisis unfolding outside. When did you learn to think like a general? About the same time I learned to think like a bookkeeper who could catch a lie in a column of numbers, she said, not looking away from the window. Turns out surviving on nothing but wit and nerve for 3 years teaches a person a great deal about how to fight smart instead of just fighting hard. Outside, Beaumont's voice rose again, ragged with a fury that had curdled somewhere along the road into something closer to madness. You took everything from me. Whitaker, my land, my money, my whole life's work over a few dates. That didn't match on some survey. Nobody would have ever checked if that woman hadn't come sniffing through my business. You stole that land, Beaumont! Nate shouted back through the barred door, his voice carrying hard and clear across the yard. Every acre of it, off families who trusted the territorial office to protect them. You didn't lose anything that was ever rightfully yours to begin with. I built an empire out of nothing, same as you did. I built mine with silver. I dug out of this mountain with my own 2 hands. You built yours on paper. You falsified, and men you cheated. There's no comparing the two, and you know it, which is exactly why you're standing in my yard with hired guns, instead of sitting in some office arguing your case. Honest. A shot rang out. It came from Beaumont's side. Wild, unaimed, more a release of raw fury than any calculated attack, and it buried itself in the timber above the door with a crack that sent everyone inside the lodge dropping low. That's it. Beaumont's voice had gone entirely unhinged now. You want to hide behind your walls? Whitaker, fine. We'll bring the walls down around you, same as you brought my whole life down around me. Evelyn's heart was hammering, but her mind stayed sharp, sorting through options with the same cold clarity she'd once brought to a falsified boundary survey. Nate, the old shaft. The east entrance you mentioned, the one that connects near the property line. What about it? If Silas and 2 men could circle round through it, while Beaumont's watching the front of the house, they could come up behind his position entirely unseen. Catch them in a pincer before another shot's fired. Nate stared at her a moment, then turned to Silas with something fierce and grateful blazing in his eyes. You heard her. Already moving, Silas said, and slipped out through the back before anyone could argue the risk of it. The wait that followed was its own particular agony, every minute stretching long and taut, while Beaumont's men fanned out across the yard torches, throwing wild shadows against the timber walls, his voice rising and falling in ragged threats that grew less coherent with every passing minute. He's cracking, Evelyn murmured, watching through the gap in the shutter. Listen to him, Nate. That's not a man executing a plan anymore. That's a man falling apart in real time. Falling apart men are the most dangerous kind, Nate said grimly. Nothing left to calculate, nothing left to lose. Just rage, looking for somewhere to land. As if summoned by the words themselves, one of Beaumont's men suddenly hurled a torch toward the barn, and flame caught fast against dry wood-orange light, licking up into the darkening sky with terrible speed. The horses? Nate was moving before Evelyn could stop him, wrenching the bar off the door despite his splinted arm, despite every promise he'd extracted from her not an hour before. Nate, wait. But he was already out into the yard, and Evelyn's own promise, the one about the root cellar, the one about staying safely hidden. No matter what happened above, her burned away in an instant against the far more urgent fact that the man she loved had just run out into a yard full of armed men, with nothing but a splinted arm and sheer stubborn will to protect him. She grabbed the shotgun kept by the door, the one Nate had shown her how to load and fire during those tense days after the first threats began, and went out after him. The yard had become chaos flames climbing the barn wall, horses screaming in their stalls. Nate, hauling the barn door open despite the smoke already pouring thick and black into the night air, and Beaumont catching sight of him exposed and vulnerable in the firelight, raising his own weapon with an expression of savage, triumphant fury. Nate. Evelyn's scream tore out of her before she'd even fully registered the danger, and she raised the shotgun hands, steadier than she'd have believed possible, and fired a warning shot into the ground between Beaumont and his target. The crack of it froze everyone in the yard for one suspended, terrible second. Beaumont's head snapped toward her, disbelief and fury warring across his face at the sight of Evelyn Carter Whitaker, standing in the open with a shotgun leveled steady in her hands. "You'd shoot me, would you? A tavern girl playing at being a lady?" "I'd shoot any man who raises a weapon at my husband," Evelyn said. And her voice didn't shake at all now. Every ounce of fear burned away by something fiercer, something absolute. "Try me, Mr. Beaumont, and find out exactly how serious I am." For one long, breathless moment, nothing moved. Then from the tree line behind Beaumont's position, Silas's voice rang out hard and commanding. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded, every one of you, and the first man who fires another shot answers to 6 rifles instead of just the one." Beaumont's hired men, never particularly loyal to a cause beyond their pay, looked between their leader's wild, unraveling fury and the very real rifles now trained on them from 3 directions, and made the only sensible calculation left available to them. One by one, weapons lowered to the ground. "Cowards!" Beaumont spat, watching his last advantage crumble in real time. "All of you cowards, the lot! Drop it, Beaumont!" Nate had crossed the yard now, the barn fire finally beginning to smolder down under a bucket brigade the miners had thrown together with desperate speed, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who had absolutely nothing left to fear from the wreck of a person standing before him. "It's over. You've lost the land, you've lost the fortune, and now you're about to lose whatever's left of your freedom too, because attempted murder carries a great deal heavier sentence than fraud ever did." Boom! Beaumont's rifle wavered in his grip, his eyes darting between Nate and Evelyn and the ring of armed men closing steadily around him, and something in his face finally completely broke. Not surrender exactly, but the specific collapse of a man who'd built his entire identity around being the one who always won. Finally forced to confront the reality that he'd lost decisively and publicly to people he'd spent months underestimating. "She ruined me," he said, and his voice had gone strange now, hollow, almost pleading. "That woman, if she'd never opened her mouth about my surveys—" "I told the truth about your surveys, Mr. Beaumont," Evelyn said, lowering the shotgun slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, though her grip stayed steady, ready. "You ruined yourself the day you decided stealing other men's land was easier than earning your own. I only made certain the truth finally caught up to you." Beaumont's rifle finally clattered to the dirt, and he sank to his knees in the mud beside it, all the wild fury draining out of him at once, leaving behind only a broken, defeated man who'd gambled everything on one last desperate act of violence, and lost that too. The territorial marshal arrived the following morning, summoned by a rider Silas had sent racing down the mountain the moment Beaumont's men had been disarmed and bound. Charles Beaumont was led away in iron silent, now hollowed out a shell of the confident man who'd once strolled into Nate's front room, waving falsified papers like a king surveying his conquered territory. Attempted murder, arson, and enough fraud charges to fill 3 separate trials, the marshal said grimly, tightening the last of the ropes securing Beaumont to his saddle. "Man's looking at the rest of his natural life behind bars, best I can figure. You two did this territory a considerable service taking him down. We didn't do it alone." Nate said, his good arm settling around Evelyn's shoulders, drawing her close against his side. "This woman caught his lies before any of the rest of us even thought to look for them." The marshal tipped his hat toward Evelyn with genuine respect. "Word's already spreading down in Silver Ridge, ma'am. Folks are calling you the woman who outsmarted the richest crook in the territory. Reckon that's a title worth having." Evelyn watched them lead Beaumont away down the mountain trail. His shoulders slumped, his empire reduced to nothing but the horse beneath him and the irons around his wrists, and felt none of the triumph she might once have expected. Only a tired, aching relief, and beneath it, something steadier, the simple, solid knowledge that the danger was finally truly over. "It's done," she said quietly, once the marshal's party had disappeared around the bend. After everything, it's actually done. Nate turned her gently to face him, his splinted arm careful between them, his good hand cupping the side of her face, with a tenderness that had nothing left of the guarded, careful man who'd once made her sign a contract full of rules about feelings and touching. "It's done," he agreed. "And Evelyn, I think it's time we talked about what comes next." They sat together that evening by a fire that no longer felt like it belonged to a house of ghosts. The barn scorched but standing, the immediate danger past and something new and tender settling into the space where fear had lived for so many months. "The contract's got 2 more months left on it," Nate said slowly, turning something over in his good hand, a small velvet box that made Evelyn's breath catch the instant she saw it. $200 room and board, no feelings, no touching. That was the deal we signed back when I was still fool enough to believe I could keep my heart locked up separate from whatever happened between us. "Nate, I don't want the 2 months, Evelyn. I don't want the $200 either, though. You're welcome to every cent of it, if that's what you need to feel settled and secure. No strings, no arguments from me." He opened the box, and inside sat a simple gold band, plain and unadorned. Nothing like the grand jewelry a man of his wealth could have easily afforded, and somehow more precious for exactly that reason. "This belonged to my mother. I've kept it locked away for years, telling myself I'd never have cause to give it to anybody again. I was wrong. I want to marry you properly, Evelyn Carter. Not a contract. Not a business arrangement. A real marriage, witnessed by a judge who isn't investigating us for fraud, built on nothing but the truth of what's grown between us these past months." Evelyn's eyes filled tears, spilling freely now, no reason left in the world to hold them back. "You're asking me for real this time. I'm asking you for real this time." His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek, gentle, reverent. "No conditions, no rules about feelings. Just you and me, and whatever life we choose to build together from here on out for as long as we both draw breath to build it. Yes." The word came out of her without a single moment of hesitation, without the careful calculation she'd once brought to every decision in her hard, uncertain life. "Yes, Nathaniel Whitaker, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook just slightly. And when he kissed her this time, there was nothing careful about it at all. No walls, no rules, no fear of what it might cost to want something this much. Just 2 people who'd both survived more grief than any person ought to carry alone, finally allowing themselves to be fully, unguardedly happy. They traveled to Denver 3 weeks later, once Nate's arm had healed enough for the journey, once the last of the paperwork regarding Beaumont's trial had been settled, and Nate's testimony recorded for the territorial court. Silas rode with them, along with a handful of the miners who'd become something closer to family over the difficult months, and the wedding itself was small, simple, held before a judge in a modest chapel with sunlight streaming clean through tall windows. Evelyn wore a dress of pale blue. Not Margaret's shawl, never that, but a color chosen entirely her own, and when she walked down the short aisle toward the man waiting for her, she saw in his face none of the careful, guarded distance from that first meeting in the tavern. Only open, unguarded love. The specific joy of a man who'd once believed himself permanently closed off from happiness, finally allowing himself to receive it. "Do you, Nathaniel Whitaker, take this woman?" "I do," he said before the judge had even finished the question, drawing a soft ripple of laughter from the small gathering. "And do you, Evelyn Carter, take this man?" "I do," she echoed, steady, certain no hesitation left in her at all. When the judge pronounced them married, truly married, no contract, no conditions, no rules about feelings that had already broken wide open weeks before, Nate kissed her soft and slow in front of everyone gathered, and Evelyn felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely safe. They returned to the mountain lodge as spring finally broke fully across the ridge. Snow melting into rushing streams, wildflowers pushing up stubborn and bright through soil that had spent months buried under white. The house that had once felt like a tomb, all locked rooms and buried grief, had become instead something Evelyn could only describe as alive, warm, lived in, filled with the sounds of a marriage built on truth instead of desperation. One evening, several weeks after their return, Evelyn found Nate standing again at the edge of the tree line before the two small graves that had once seemed to her like the boundary of everything he refused to let himself feel. She came and stood beside him, quiet, not intruding, simply present. "I used to come out here and tell myself I was protecting their memory," he said softly, "by never letting anybody else matter as much as they did. Like loving you again would somehow be a betrayal of loving them. And now I think Margaret would have liked you a great deal." His voice carried none of the old grief's sharp edges, only something softer, healed, tender. "She'd have liked how you set my kitchen table straight without being asked. She'd have liked how you caught Beaumont's lies before any of the rest of us thought to look. I think she'd have been glad, Evelyn, knowing this house finally had someone in it who could love it back to life." Evelyn took his hand, and together they stood a long moment before the small markers, not in grief now, but in something closer to gratitude for what had been and for what had, against every hard odd, managed to grow again in its place. "A home isn't built from stone or gold or land," she said quietly, echoing something she'd come to understand across every hard month of this journey. "It's built by the person who chooses to stay through every storm, every threat, every dark hour when leaving would have been so much easier." "You stayed," Nate said, turning to face her fully, his eyes bright with everything he no longer had to guard against feeling. "Through all of it, you stayed." "I stayed," she agreed. "Because somewhere along the way, Nathaniel Whitaker, this stopped being your house and became our home. And I don't intend to ever leave it, not for money, not for danger, not for anything this world could possibly throw at us." The mountain stood tall and silent behind them, no longer a monument to loneliness and loss, but something new entirely. A place where two broken people had found against every reasonable expectation. A love strong enough to survive fraud fire and every desperate threat a cruel man could throw against it. Charles Beaumont stood trial that autumn and was sentenced to the full weight of the law. His empire of stolen land returned to the families he'd cheated. His name spoken in Silver Ridge only as a cautionary tale about the cost of greed left unchecked. Grady, stripped of the protection Beaumont's money had once provided him, left the territory entirely rather than face the fraud charges Evelyn's testimony made certain would follow him. And in the mountain lodge that had once been a tomb of unspoken grief, a marriage that began as nothing more than a desperate business arrangement between a broken widow and a grieving landowner grew season after season into something neither one of them had dared hope to find again. Evelyn Carter. Whitaker, once dismissed as nothing more than a tavern girl with nothing left to lose, became known across the territory as the woman whose sharp mind and unbroken courage had brought down the most powerful crook the Northern Ridge had ever seen. And Nathaniel Whitaker, once the coldest, loneliest man on the mountain, became known instead as a husband who had finally fully learned that love was never truly a weakness at all. It was the courage to stay through every storm that made a house a home. And theirs built from nothing but truth, loyalty, and a love that had survived fire fraud and every desperate threat sent against it, would stand strong upon that mountain for the rest of their days.